Okay, everybody, welcome to chapter three. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I am making sure before I actually begin that I'm actually recording. Okay. Um, I want to give a special thanks to uh, Tanya for recording the last session. I'm currently working on adjusting the audio for that session. Sorry, apologies in the delay for getting the second half of chapter two. Just work with me, give me a little bit of time, and we'll fill in. But from here on out, I'll make sure things are recorded. If you're listening for the first time, perhaps on IG Live or something like that, uh, you're welcome to join in on the live stream. You can see the slides eventually you'll be able to like participate if you want to join in. I tend to ask questions and get responses and things like that. I can see people's feedback, so if you want to join in, click the link in my bio on my IG page, and then you'll be able to join in, see the slides, see the chat, perhaps even participate in a question or two. And then also, if you're listening on IG Live, I need you to know that Instagram has done a thing where they put a 1 hour limit on live streams. So at some point in the middle of this lecture, it will cut out. That's an Instagram related issue, not necessarily a technological related issue. And if you'd like to continue the entire lecture, then jump over into the Zoom session. If you'd like to support me, you can join my Patreon, but all of the materials to this class are entirely free. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to like and subscribe, share this with your friends, and those kinds of things. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Um, we're jumping into chapter three. So prior to this, we have established, first of all, the origins of American slavery. Where did that industry come from? How did it come about? How did it come to be? And now that we've moved away from the continent of Africa, or at least the region of West Africa, and its rich history, we're now over into colonial North America, and what does that look like? Okay, friendly reminder: this chapter is going to be split in two. So we're only going to cover the first half of chapter three. Next week we'll cover the latter half of it. However, friendly reminder, right? There are people that already exist in North America. They have existed for thousands of years. We've established that through anthropological evidence that these indigenous people, whom I like to refer to as the first Americans, that's not necessarily to minimize how other indigenous descended people might prefer to be identified. However, I'd like to describe the comprehensive whole of those who occupy the continental United States as being the first Americans, since we call this land America. Okay. Now, I've already spoken on this specific slide last week or the week prior, I believe. So I'm not going to elaborate in too much detail. However, I'd like to add just a little bit of knowledge here. Is that when we're talking about North America, you must also understand that that includes the region we now know to be Mexico, although some parts of it would include Central America too, as well as Peru and things like that. But when we're talking about North America, we are including that region of Mexico because technically it is a part of the continent. Right. Now, having said that, I'd like to establish for you that the native people, the indigenous people that lived in these lands before colonial rule, just like the Africans, they were not people who were just savages of the bush that were picking their noses and waiting for the white man to come and civilize them. These are people that have rich histories, scholarship, spirituality. They specialized in monarchies. They had mathematics and astronomy. Of course, they had different tribes. They're not just monolithic. Don't think of them as being monolithic simply because I can, at least for the sake of simplicity, describe them as being monolithic. Some of these people would have identified as Anasazi. Other people would identify as Pueblo. And they had their own rich histories, which included complex forms of agriculture. Right. There's some anthropological evidence I'd like to at least briefly deviate really quick. There's some anthropological evidence that would say that the origins of agricultural practice among permanently stable human societies originated somewhere in the Middle East about 10 to 12,000 years ago. If you want to fact check me on that, feel free to Google search and things like that. But around 10,000 years ago. Um, and yet, we have evidence that these indigenous people were existing in the Americas for over 10,000 years, upwards of 12 to 15,000 years prior. So, one of the interesting anthropological questions that I have, and if someone has an answer to it, feel free to fact check me, because I don't necessarily have the answer, is did complex agricultural practices emerge kind of convergently to what we observe of the agricultural practice in the Middle East that would then go and spread across the old world? Did these people develop agriculture in tandem and almost separate? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But the point is that they had the intellectual capacity and sophistication to be able to develop highly complex technology, systems of thought, philosophy, and a lot of that knowledge, a lot of that culture is lost, not necessarily to time, but to slaughter. Right. They also organized comprehensively in the ways that other old world civilizations also did. They had divisions of labor with people who had specialized practices or specialized skills. They also had urban centers. For those of you, I guess the best bastardized example that I can immediately think of, because this is tandem to the core point of the lecture. If you've seen a film called Apocalypto, I think Apocalypto at least makes an honest effort to recapture the complexities of these societies, although we could go into detail about how it mischaracterizes them for the sake of their barbarism and things like that. Yeah, Rodrigo says, haha, what a movie. Yeah, absolutely, right? It's a great movie. It's entertaining on its own, but one of the things that it does is it establishes that these people were highly complex and civilized. So I want you to understand that the things that were lost with the introduction of these European colonies is the removal of these culture, the delegitimization of these cultures, the removal of their knowledge, of their philosophy, and a hardcore mission to convert many of these people to Catholicism, mostly under the threat of death. Okay, so please keep that in mind. And the burning of their books, too. Yes, they had libraries, and their libraries were also destroyed. How much philosophy, knowledge might we have gained through a more peaceful encounter if not to destroy those things? And that was part of their displacement. Okay. So now that I've established that, I want to address this elementary school narrative around, well, when the colonizers arrived, they shared a meal and everyone was happy and they had a turkey, and this is how we had Thanksgiving. And believe it or not, to some extent, this is true. Okay. Now, as I'm characterizing the slaughter, the genocide, the killing, the missions, the conversion, and things like that, um, do remember that in the lectures prior, I did mention that it didn't start off with just mass genocide and slaughter. It really did, in fact, start off with just figuring out who these people were and having more or less peaceful exchanges. It's just that that elementary school narrative that you might be familiar with, especially if you were born and raised in a part of colonized Americas, is that that's the only part that's narrowly focused on. There's a lot of complex history that's just kind of selectively ignored and removed from this specific narrative. Okay. And so part of this peaceful exchange, believe it or not, actually comes from the fact that most of these native people were far more harmonious in coexisting among different tribes than their old world counterparts. And I say old world not to isolate Europe as somehow being an anomaly to hostility and exploitation and things like that, but the hostility, the exploitation, the slavery, things like that, that is a fundamental norm of the old world that they brought with them to the Americas. And part of the reason why we can kind of say this is due to the technological sophistication around warfare that we observe among the empires of the old world in comparison to the Native Americans in the quote unquote New World. Right? Is that they're just not as technologically sophisticated for warfare because they don't regularly engage in warfare, not as frequently as their European counterparts do. They're certainly far less exploitative. Now, having said that, there are some people that would go, "Oh, well, no, you had tribes that were scalping people and they were murdering and they were doing intertribal warfare." I'm not saying none of that existed. Absolutely, some of these atrocities are just fundamental hallmarks of just being human, right? But aside from that, if we were to treat each of these tribes as like monoliths, they were in fact experts at harmonious cohabitation, where the people of the old world really could not wrap their heads around that. So this is where the people of the old world would then default to this notion that, like, well, why don't we just exploit them? I don't want to say it's in their nature by virtue of being white, but rather it's in their nature by virtue of being of the old world, where that was an operative and functional norm. Okay. Um, with this kind of peaceful introduction of these people and of these groups, this is where you get lots of like American crops that become staples of the colonial diet, whether that's turkey, pumpkin, or something to that effect. Much of the traditional ingredients that go into a Thanksgiving meal then become, in a way, colonized, for lack of a better term. Right. Okay. Now, having said that, reminder, these colonizers are also importing, like regularly importing Africans. Okay. And where they're regularly importing these African people, then you're introducing another set of traits, phenotypes, different cultures, different kinds of people who we would call racial groups into this complex introduction of human beings in a new context, right? And so what happens then is, by virtue of being human and by virtue of being biological organisms, if you stick two humans on an island in isolation for long enough and they're male and female, either one of them will start using their imagination to think about sexual encounters and reproduction and things like that. So it's entirely plausible, if not expected, that once you introduce Africans into this dynamic, that you're going to see uh, cross pollinations of every permutation. You will have Africans that are mating with the natives that are mating with white people that are mating with black people, and so on and so forth, right? Um, and so that's what's happening here is some Africans would try to free themselves. They didn't just show up on the shores and then just go, well, they got me. I guess I'm just in slavery now, and I'm not going to leave. Many of the like early waves of Africans were trying to establish their freedom separate from these European enslavers, which often meant then that they were seeking refuge among the First Nation or the First American people. Okay. And so where many of them did in fact successfully get away, especially in those early colonial years, um, much of the colonial settlements are not mature yet. And there's a lot of the American land that still belongs to these native people. So for Africans to then show up at some tribe, some village, some community, and then basically try to figure out their way into staying there, that inevitably happens. And then from that, what happens is you get the production of a new kind of human being a hybrid between African people and these natives. Many of these people still exist today. Yes, they would be considered biracial. Many of these people, if you live in the region of Arizona or New Mexico, even some parts of, I want to say, Western Texas, it kind of might be a norm to see Black people who are biracial between Native and African. Also in Alaska, the northern region, the continental region of the US, right? Um, in Alaska, you will often see these kinds of pairings, these kinds of people who have African and native like hybridized features. And so many of the pictures that you see here are from the modern era. A few of them are from like the 1920s, but these are some of the faces of the people who would inevitably be products of their parents somehow managed to free themselves from enslavement and then find refuge among the natives, right? It also then is the case that with these European colonizers importing Africans for the purpose of slavery, they are then introducing the practice of slavery to these natives. And some of these natives would then take on that practice of taking slaves, which meant that they too were slaveholders of African people. Okay. So on occasion, again, not necessarily treating natives as a monolith, but rather dependent on the group, dependent on the tribe, dependent on the region, you then have some native groups that were willing to collaborate with white colonizers to crush slave revolts. Again, having said that, that is not to say that all of these native people were doing that, or all of these white people who were colonizers were doing that. But depending on the group and depending on the context, you did have. The best way I could say it is it's kind of like Murphy's Law, right? Like whatever can happen will happen. Whatever permutation of whatever variables and factors that exist in a given space will produce certain kinds of outcomes that will inevitably happen. And so this is just the case, right? Um, and then because Black people are still people, believe it or not, not all of them are enslaved simply by virtue of being Black. You then have some Black people that are, in fact, assisting in the slave trade, in the importation of more Africans, in the distribution of those slaves. Some of them are serving as slaves and facilitating the expansion of slavery. Others are just like they just exist because they were slave catchers in Africa that decided to get on a ship and go and help on the other side. So it becomes a thing, like I said, where you have to kind of think of it like Murphy's Law. Whatever can happen will happen. And in this case, you can't assume that either any racial group that's involved in this dynamic here is inherently monolithic. Okay. Um, so just you can kind of think about it that way. Now, I think I showed you these images before. In fact, I know I did. Um, where I kind of already said this because I'm jumping ahead of myself. You have Africans and natives that are able to gain their freedom. Some natives they were trying to enslave some natives. They gained their freedom. You have Africans that are escaping and gain their freedom because much of the colonial regions of North America are still underdeveloped. And so then once they gain their freedom, many of them, especially Africans, would in fact go on to just become landholders. And by landholders, I'm talking about this under the sort of colonizer concept of the ownership of land. A lot of these native tribes didn't necessarily ascribe to this idea of like a person somehow owns the land. To my knowledge, depending on the tribe, there are philosophies around this notion that no one really owns any of that because you can't put it in your possession. Um, Chris asks, was this when land ownership was equal to voting rights? Not necessarily. We haven't yet gotten to voting or politics just yet because in the colonies you have to understand that like on the early area in the early period of this they're really just trying to build houses, trying to build buildings, trying to build slave pens, trying to establish plots of land that they're going to treat as plantations and then build those plantation mansions. So in that early era you don't really have like we're going to elect this person to do this role and then who gets what rights to what. It's too early for that, right? Now having said that, you have Africans that are like becoming landowners where they are able to enforce ownership of a specific plot of land and attempt to keep people from trying to like occupy it, either because they get access to firearms, they get access to some form of defense, or the surrounding community is also respecting their right to that specific land. I can't really explain it any more detailed than that. Some of them become tradesmen, and by tradesmen, I don't just mean slave traders, but I mean for other resources and goods. Perhaps it's furs, perhaps it's pelts, perhaps it's minerals or other things. You also get people who then become militiamen, men who are useful in circumstances in which they need to protect a specific group of people or something like that. They start taking on new roles outside of just you're black and you're here, so you must be a slave. That it's kind of like it's just a colonial norm that we often treat Black people as somehow being inherently enslaved and like belonging to slavery by virtue of being black and existing in this period during this time, when in fact the vast majority were slaves, but a lot of them were able, there were plenty that were able to free themselves and to distinguish themselves from the institution of slavery. So just kind of keep that in mind. Like I said, whatever can happen in this circumstance will happen. We're talking about what happens on Earth in real time in the universe under this notion of, I don't know, quantum entanglement, if you want to call it, right? Just kind of think about it that way. That this in real life, it's going to be far more complex than this sort of simpleton understanding that we've come to know and understand through grade school, right? Okay, so now I want you to understand that where you had Spain and you had Portugal that were colonizing the Americas, that's fundamentally distinct from the English who attempted to colonize the Americas, right? Like I said, in answering Chris's question, we're talking about this before we get into politics, where perhaps to put a number to it, we're talking about like the 1500s, right? Um, and so the English, being the Christian counterparts that are allies with the Spaniards and the Portuguese, hear that there's this new land and they can go lay claim to it if they can make it across. And they want a piece of the pie. England wants a piece of the pie too. But in the 1500s, England is kind of like they're impoverished. And part of the reason that they're impoverished is by comparison to Spain and Portugal. If you think about it in this way, Spain and Portugal are closer to Africa and more direct connection to other regions of the Mediterranean, whereas England is kind of like off on an island. Okay. So Spain and Portugal have access to slaves. They have access to slave labor. They have access to African resources and goods that they're trading and have been trading for thousands of years. And the English, who are kind of just stuck on this island, more or less, they're not in a comparative and equal economic standing to the Spanish and the Portuguese. So this idea of like England just came and they laid claim to 13 colonies and it just happened overnight, that's actually not really what happened. Okay. The English actually could not afford to even send a single ship over into the Americas like they wanted to because they just were too poor and didn't have the resources to be able to appoint anyone to survive such a journey. Okay. So, excuse me, before I go ahead, I want to establish this one thing here. And the one thing is that eventually, where they would establish the first settlement and the first colony, they were heavily dependent on the natives to teach them how to survive the harsh blizzards, the tornadoes, the hurricanes, the extreme weather phenomena that is not normative to England. They didn't really have the sophistication to be able to sustain or to live through those things. So they were heavily dependent on the natives to do so. However, I want to answer the question that you might be asking of how did England get to the Americas if they couldn't afford to get there? Well, believe it or not, this is where the Anglo-Spanish War comes into play. And I want you to think about the size of the country of Spain. If you're sitting at your computer right now, think about look up the country of Spain geographically, like on Google Maps or something, right? And you will see the size of Spain. It's actually a fairly small country. Portugal is even smaller. Okay. So now, relative to the size of Spain in Europe, I want you to think about how many Spanish speaking countries currently exist in the Americas today. There are a lot of them, like a shit ton, right? Well, how did that happen? Well, the reason is because Spain pretty much spread themselves incredibly thin. Okay. They were so gung ho about getting as much territory as they possibly could. Oh my God, I got to get as much as I could. I got to go get a piece of this pie. This is mine. That's mine. That's mine. That's mine. That's not yours. We'll go to war for it. This is ours. It becomes a thing where Spain spreads themselves so thin and they're slaughtering these people and converting them so aggressively that actually back in Europe, they managed to weaken themselves so much that the English would actually engage in a naval war with Spain at one point in time to try to take over their resources because they're a competitor and they're vulnerable, which led to the Anglo-Spanish War. Took place between 1585 and 1604, and essentially England is able to just kind of topple Spain I don't know, like imagine my cat running through toilet paper. It's just it's not it's a war, but it's not really like an arduous fight, right? So this becomes a thing where the English are able to basically acquire much of the resources from these naval victories that would then give them the economic stability and the resources to sustain a journey across the Atlantic Ocean. And by doing so, they would essentially raise enough money that they would then appoint these joint stock companies to try to go into the Americas and lay stake to some claim of land that they can say belongs to the English monarchy. Okay. So this is where you get one of the first permanent British colonies in 1607, almost immediately after the Anglo-Spanish War, called Jamestown. Now, before we get to Jamestown, the company that was responsible for establishing Jamestown was called the Merchants of Virginia. Okay. Now, the Merchants of Virginia is a company named after the Virgin Mary. Okay. And Jamestown, the first settlement of what we know to be the colonies of the United States, would inevitably belong to what state? The state of Virginia. Okay. So this is how the first state in the United States, believe it or not, is named after a company. So when I tell you, going back all the way to the first lecture, I think it was, where I was saying American culture is capitalism, this would be like, I suppose, a modern analogy would be like the US government gave Tesla, or no, gave Jeff Bezos $6 billion to fund a colonization effort to the moon or Mars, whichever, tomato, tomato. The point is another interstellar body. And when they get there and they establish their first colony, Jeff Bezos decides to name that first colony or the region that encompasses that first colony Amazon. Right? Um, it's kind of like that. Didn't Pepsi try to project their logo onto the moon at some point? I have no idea. I've never heard of that at all. Uh, Thanks, Chris. I have no idea. Somebody fact check. Feel free. Cinematic ending. Um, so it becomes a thing where I need you to understand the cultural significance. Often we as Westerners, I would even go so far as to say Americans, we often separate the concept of capitalism from culture. We often think of culture as something that inherently belongs to a group of ethnic people, like indigenous culture. It's a way of living, a mode of thinking, perhaps a system of beliefs and music and food and blah, blah, blah. And we often inherently think of capitalism as somehow being inherently separate from that. And I want you to reconcile that right now, that when I'm talking about the cultural implications of capitalism in America, I'm literally talking about capitalism being the foundation upon which American culture is built. Okay. Um, so inevitably, the Virginia Company or the Merchants of Virginia would basically establish a settlement in the Chesapeake region of what we know today to be Virginia, and then would establish a small town that they would name Jamestown. Okay. Okay, so now I'm referring to the Virginia Company as TVC. Okay, now TVC didn't really have a stake. How can you have an economic stake in a land where you don't really know how you're going to farm your resources and build your wealth? So the Virginia Company essentially is hoping to make a profit by trying to find something to build a resource, something that they can ship over to England, and then England can try to build wealth, perhaps even send ships down into West Africa and then start to establish slave labor on their own. So the Virginia Company is trying to find gold. They're trying to like maybe establish trade with the natives, the first Americans, right? Import European goods and resources that these natives don't have in exchange for resources that the Europeans don't have, and then try to build wealth that way. They tried cutting lumber and then shipping lumber across, which, believe it or not, is kind of expensive, especially during this particular point in time. They're trying to raise crops. They're trying to grow things like rice, sugar, silk, they're trying to take the crops or the resources that they deem to be economically valuable in the Western world that can only really be gotten from like India or China or somewhere really far, and they're trying to grow them in the Americas. But unfortunately, if you know the region of Virginia, you know that like rice, sugar, silk, it's just environmentally, geographically speaking, this environment is just not ideal for growing those kinds of crops. So it just none of these things really worked. Okay. So them trying to cultivate some kind of economic resource didn't work until the natives introduced to them this plant they called tobacco. Okay. And tobacco was a plant that they grew um, on these plots of land. They would curate it, they would dry it out, and then they would roll it up and smoke it. Okay. And in smoking it, it gave this like euphoric sensation. It's very short lived, it's mild. Some of the natives had cultural customs around tobacco, or at least the consumption of tobacco, and they found that this is actually a profitable crop. So the Virginia company's first, let's say, business expenditure was to try to grow tobacco in mass and then ship it back to the British monarchy. Okay. And so this is inevitably how the culture of tobacco smoking would then become precedent worldwide. Is that this is the crop that can actually grow in Virginia and sustain. It's adapted to the environment, but it does in fact require like intensive labor. Okay. Tobacco and tobacco cultivation is very delicate. It requires like daily, hands-on, extensive effort. So it meant then that the Virginia company is like learning firsthand from the natives how to cultivate tobacco so that they can grow it in mass. So this is where I say the precedent of capitalism, and capitalism for the purpose of like profit and economic gain, is something on which America as a nation is inherently founded. Okay. Um, and so at this point in time, because crop cultivation is just too intense. It's too hard for such a small group of people on a small plot, or a settlement called Jamestown. It's just too intensive. So what you do is you've got to figure out like the people who are essentially indentured servants to the Virginia Company are like complaining to their overseers, more or less, the people who are above them, superior to them, that like it's just not realistic to try to grow tobacco when it requires this much in-depth effort. Um, they need help. And according to who they know, like on their Spanish counterparts, the Spanish have slaves, the Portuguese have slaves. Why can't we have slaves, right? That's like where the pressure of these colonizers is coming from, is like, we want slaves too. Well, unfortunately, at this point in time, the Virginia Company and the British monarchy are just too poor to really like try to have a hand in the culture of slave labor. Okay. So the British colonizers, like I said, the indentured servants, are kind of pressuring their overseers, their superiors, to figure out how you're going to get the slave labor, because we can't do all of this by ourselves. Okay. And it wasn't until the 1700s, which we will inevitably get to, that the British could then afford African slave labor. So, what would they do? Like, what are we going to do if we can't afford to go and buy slaves or barter for slaves in West Africa? Well, some crafty individuals from Jamestown came up with this really clever idea where essentially enslave the people they already have. No, 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 no. The people who are doing the tobacco cultivation in Jamestown right now are all indentured servants of the Virginia Company. They're all white, they're all British, and they're just poor, impoverished, working class, but they're a part of this colony. And it's just not. They need the help. They need help, and they're complaining about it. So some of these people within the Jamestown colony had this crafty idea. Well, if we can't afford slave labor, what if we just went down to West Africa anyway? And the Spaniards are having all of these African slave catchers destabilize the people in this region. What if we went down there to some of the people who managed to get away and didn't find themselves enslaved and just said, hey, there's this new piece of land. We need some help cultivating it. If you join this indenture and engage in labor, indentured labor for X amount of years, you'll get your freedom and then you can go and you can have your own plot of land, but then we can get the help that way. And so that's what they did. Wait, hold on. That's what they did. Okay. So they successfully recruited 32 Africans, 15 men, 17 women, literally that small, onto a single ship and it was a stretch, but onto a single ship that then they imported these Africans who it was understood for Jamestown that these black people, they're not slaves, they're indentured servants. Okay. So these indentured servants are brought in to serve Jamestown officials, the leaders, the working class. They're working alongside the working class. And unlike the Portuguese and the Spanish, these black people are considered to be unfree by virtue of the indenture, but they're not slaves. At this point in time, they don't have slave laws or slave codes or anything like that. And because the British have this kind of cultural custom of being, um, I want to say like dot your or cross your T's and dot your I's. They're very like by the book on their own cultural customs. At least early on, they genuinely are willing to honor the contract of the indenture. That after a certain amount of years, these black people are free to go, and then they can go and live their lives. And they're actually doing that. Okay, so part of the incentive for recruiting these Africans is that according to Old English custom, these Africans could not be enslaved if they had Christian names. So if they were willing to abandon their African name, it could have been Kunta Kinte, for example, um, and they took up a name like Toby, then they could be freed or like protected from enslavement. So you have black people that are going, well, how do I know that you're not going to enslave me if I get on this ship and I go? Well, take an English name, and if you take a Christian name, then you're protected, and it really is then about your indenture at that point. Okay, so eventually you had, especially this first wave of Africans, they really did. They worked alongside these white people as equals. Some of them married together, they slept together, they shared space together, they were like cohabitating, and many of these Africans did in fact successfully work off their indenture and then go back to figure out what their new life was going to be in the Americas. And that's how some of these other black people also then found their way to freedom, that they're then becoming tradesmen and militiamen and these kinds of things, right? Okay. Now, the what's happening here, the fundamental flaw, I suppose, some of my slides are out of whack. I need to like reorder this. So excuse me, I'm kind of talking out of order. However, a fundamental flaw in this system of indenture is that you have uh, you have to let them go after a period of time. Well, what do? Well, they're not here to work anymore because you let them go, which means you're short on labor. So it creates this pressure point for Jamestown where, like, they really don't want to let these people go because if you let them go, then what was the point? You just went across the Atlantic Ocean and back again to bring these people only to let them go. It's not even fair. And so what's happening is as the Jamestown colony is expanding into what would become the 13 colonies over time, the colonies of the British monarchy, um, you inevitably get contact with these British colonizers and the Spanish in Mexico and the region south of Mexico. Okay. And what's happening is the Spanish have a way of colloquially, excuse me, referring to their Africans as los negros. Okay. And los negros in Spanish means the blacks. Now, you have to think about this and consider that the people of West Africa, whether they're coming from Ghana or Sudan, look up these people or images of these people on on Google, they literally are black, like incredibly black, almost comparable to the color of coal. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean that in an academic way. So please don't come and throw rotten tomatoes at me for saying that, right? But they literally are black. And so, yes, there are cultural connotations associated with calling them Los Negros, and being in a position of inherent inferiority. But the British would then come to adopt the name negro. Okay. And instead of calling it negro, they would anglicize it to become negro. Okay. So negro, when you make the word plural, it has an OES rather than an OS like it would in Spanish because this word became anglicized. Okay. And so then the British would then call the black people who were indentured servants and eventually their own slaves, they would refer to them as Negroes. Okay. And then Negroes became Nigras. Nigras, if you say it fast, if you say it and you're kind of slurring it, Nigras, and then Nigras evolves into niggers, and then niggers eventually in the modern era becomes nigga, right? Um, and so that's how you get the evolution of this word is the British are now starting to adopt some of the cultural perspectives of Black people, the ways that they treat them, the language that they use to describe them, those kinds of things, while they're also developing a kind of emotional fervor around this notion of, well, the Spanish get to keep their blacks or their Negroes. Why can't we keep ours? And that emotional fervor is kind of sowing a kind of resentment that these British people need to do something to hold on to their Negroes. Okay. So reinforcement, because of course I always jump ahead of myself here. I'm gonna do this real quickly because I already said this. Blacks and whites between the 1620s and the 1670s during this time are working on these tobacco farms together. They slept together, they cohabitated together, they lived together, they married together. The white people who were indentured servants and the black people who were indentured servants were they were equals, more or less. Okay, so I've already established that. Moving on. Okay. So most of these Africans that would inevitably arrive into the America in these indentured servitude agreements, the culture of indentured servitude would ultimately evolve into I guess I want to say these people are being overworked. And the reason why they're being overworked is because these British contract holders want to get as much labor or extract as much labor from these people in the context of their contract as possible. Okay. That also has capitalist origins or implications too. So make the connection. I want you to actively make the connection as I'm talking about this. The people who held or managed the contracts for these indentures are trying to maximize the productive output that these recruited Africans are signing into, which then means that they're overworking them. And in overworking them, many of these people are becoming sick. Some of them are dying before their release. Eventually, indentured servitude would become a thing in these colonies where a lot of the Africans that were recruited in the later years were actually never able to get their freedom. And the people who were putting them in these indentures, they knew that, but they're recruiting them anyway into this. It's almost like a bait and switch. I want to, for lack of a better comparison, I suppose, I would liken it to the movie Get Out. Like everybody knows that we're trying to seduce these black people for the purpose of exploiting them. And then once we exploit them and they're here, they can't do anything about it. They can't free themselves. They can't get away. But the point was we got you, we trapped you, essentially, right? So think about that in the context of capitalism, right? But as we transition from the 1640s into the 1700s here, okay, it becomes a thing where the culture of black people and white people working and living together also begins to evolve because as time goes on, these white British people are having regular contact with the Spaniards, mainly the Spaniards. the Spaniards who are looking down on their black people, who are abusing their black people, who are normalizing the power dynamics of white supremacy in these Spanish regions. Okay, or now Spanish speaking regions, right? Okay. And so what's happening is the British colonizers are beginning to bring some of those sentiments back to their homes, for lack of a better term, right? They're bringing those sentiments with them. And where they have at precedent a culture of indentured servitude, it starts to become a thing where, like, the British colonizers, the white people anyway, are starting to racialize their own environment. Because if you're white, perhaps you're an indentured servitude, you're an indentured servant, but you could also be a political leader. You might have political power. But if you're black, at least in the context of these colonies, you can only be an indentured servant. We know what you're here for. The only reason you're here and you're black is because you're here to work. So the visible differences between black and white people would inevitably become a thing where it starts to sow like racial division within these colonies. And over time, then, where they're leaning into getting more harsh and more like invested in the culture of indentured servitude, it starts to evolve into like morphing indentured servitude into just straight up chattel slavery, where now many white people are starting to adopt this notion that the black people that they share space with is inherently inferior to them by virtue of the nature of their racial dynamics or the racial phenomenon going on here. Okay. So what's happening now is there are so many Africans that are being brought over by the Spaniards that now the British colonies, as they're expanding, as they're becoming more economically stable and sound, again, transitioning from the 1640s to the 1700s, African slaves are actually becoming more cheaper as a source or a resource of labor than white indentured servitude. And part of the reason for this is because the Spaniards are bringing over so many Africans that now they have Africans that they can actually sell to the British colonizers. So, in this transition over time, there was, in fact, a period in time in which there were black people who were indentured slaves. There were black people who were not indentured slaves, excuse me, I'm mixing my words, indentured servants, and then black people who were slaves that existed in the same space. And functionally, like fundamentally on paper, they're different, but functionally, there is no difference. Okay. So it becomes a thing where, like, now the Spaniards are starting to breed slaves and they're starting to share their slaves, sell their slaves to these British colonizers. Okay. And then over time, it becomes a thing where there's just not a motive to continue to indenture white people as servants. Not when you can have a regular influx of black people who are permanently enslaved and stay that way. Um, this then means that you can free white people, the poor working white class, you can free them to go and do other things, perhaps start their own company, perhaps build their own homes, perhaps build their own wealth and contribute to the expansion of the colonies. Um, but it becomes a thing where now the culture of British colonies, excuse me, the British colonizers are starting to like morph the culture into chattel slavery. So the context in which the United States of America would ultimately emerge is very distinct and different from the Spanish and the Portuguese colonization of the Americas. Okay, so this creates a racial dynamic in which poor white people now find themselves in inherently better positions just by virtue of being white. And at this point in time, they don't identify as white. So when I use the word white here, that's my language. Okay. At this point in time, they're just British. They're just English. Okay. But for the sake of the racial message here, it's by virtue of their whiteness now that they now find themselves in inherently better economic opportunities. They're able to grow wealth for themselves, perhaps pursue another economic venture where they can build wealth for themselves. My throat is getting dry. Give me a second. Okay. So over time, the British, because of the way in which there was a kind of cultural evolution away from indentured servitude and into chattel slavery, the British became rather aggressive, or rather, the British colonizers became like really aggressive in wanting to lean into the culture of chattel slavery. Now they're not just buying slaves from the Spaniards for the sake of buying slaves from the Spaniards, but specifically for the case of breeding them, breeding slaves, duplicating and expanding their numbers, and then in expanding their numbers, trying to exponentially grow the slave population so that you can, in essence, generate enough economic standing and wealth to essentially be able to then go over to Africa and then get more slaves while you're breeding slaves in America. So over time, by the time, especially by the time we get to the 1700s, this is how the British would then essentially gain control of the transatlantic slave trade, essentially becoming an economic powerhouse that even overpowered the Spaniards because, again, they're spread too thin, and Portugal is so small. And in comparison to Brazil, it's almost like it's non-competitive. So cultural evolution in essence, is what would ultimately lead to them gaining control over the African slave trade by like the early 1700s. And it's by this time that they're transitioning from their old customs of indentured servitude and into chattel slavery, that they are now beginning to develop colonial laws. Yes, that is an actual term. Feel free to Google it. Colonial laws. And some of these colonial laws would attempt to dictate and regulate what people were permitted to do, how they would be treated, their value, their worth based on who they are. And part of those colonial laws were slave codes. God damn it. I have two different versions of the same book of slave codes on these images here. I'm so sorry, but there are feel free to Google this. I think that was just a human error. There were slave codes dictated and distinct based on the colony. So here you have slavery code of the District of Columbia, where you would also have the slavery code of Virginia, you would have the slavery code of New York, et cetera. It just became a thing where slave codes now, I can't possibly include all of the things that were in this book of laws, but some of the elements of these codes, excuse me, are that they are prohibiting Black people from becoming Christians. Well, why would they be prohibiting Black people from becoming Christians? Well, the reason why they're prohibiting Black people from becoming Christians is because culturally they still belong to the British monarchy, and part of old English custom here is that if you're a Christian you can't be enslaved. So what do? You codify into law that anyone who is enslaved by virtue of their skin or coming from their mother who was enslaved, they cannot become a Christian. And so because they cannot become a Christian, this then means that they are able to be enslaved. You see how that works? Okay, then you have the prohibition of Black people being allowed access to firearms or even being able to go near them. Well, why would they try to stop Black people from owning firearms or having access to them? Well, because again, none of these Africans are like, they're not just sitting in a bush going, I'm waiting for the white man to teach me how to be civil. These Black people are like, I want my fucking freedom. Like, no, fuck these people. They're evil as shit. I need to get away. And if I got to kill some of these motherfuckers in order to do so, I'm going to do so. Like, that's their sentiment. So they're codifying into law, no, Black people don't get access to these firearms because you want to prevent the slaves from being able to revolt, from being able to overthrow their enslavers. And then part of what you can see in the reflection of the cultural evolution of their racism over time is in these colonial laws, and not necessarily the slave codes, they also have codified into law notions of miscegenation. Okay, miscegenation was a term to describe the interracial sexual relations, including with the first American people. So they are prohibiting that white British people have sexual relations with Black people or the first American natives because there's this growing notion that God created these races to be distinct. And by virtue of being distinct, we need to respect God's law and the order of God's law by essentially prohibiting white people from producing any more hybridized offspring. In growing with the sentiment, because there's a cultural evolution around the notion or the industry of slavery in a way, they are starting to internalize notions of Black inferiority and notions of Black inferiority inherently posing like a biological threat to the purity, spiritual purity, cultural purity, genetic purity, although that wasn't their language at the time, but the sort of biological purity of whiteness. Okay. Um, and so that becomes codified into law too. Now, do you have people that are going to respect that? Absolutely not. Um, but behind closed doors, they're disrespecting that, right? Out in public and on its own, at least right now, it's just the thing that everyone is agreeing to. Correct. Stephanie says it sounds like white Christian nationalism. Correct. And so I want to thank you, Stephanie, for pointing that out, because I want to point out something to you. And I want you to make this connection. When you hear white Christian nationalists that are saying, I want to preserve my culture, I want to preserve my way of life. I want to preserve the things that are important to me in whatever context. They're telling the truth. That's not a lie. That's not a belief that it just comes from because they're just inherently seething with hate, and they have hate in their hearts and they just hate everybody who's not white. It's that the things that they identify as being culturally normative to them are the things that go all the way back to this specific era. Okay. So these beliefs are not an anomaly. Chris says, I was going to say, still encountering religious propaganda from that era in the modern day is very depressing. But, Chris, I need you to understand that, like in England, there are like churches, bars, even that are like 1,000 years old. You know, America is only 250, a little bit more than that, years old. Like we're not as old of a country as we want to think we are. And I know when I point to like the 1600s and the 1700s, it's very easy to then go, damn, that was a long time ago. Oh, 400 years ago, 500 years ago, and blah, blah, blah. But like the societies that these people are coming from have existed for thousands of years by comparison. So the fact that we still have lingering cultural waves from this period in time shouldn't necessarily be surprising to you, although I can understand why it would be. James says the Confederate flag, Confederate memorials, the mythology surrounding the Alamo are all in the same vein. Yes, we will inevitably get to the origin of the Confederacy. We're not there yet. Okay. Um, one more slide. Fuck it, why not? Okay, so by the time here's where we're talking about early colonial laws, right? And I've already established for you that chattel slavery is progressively emerging, and essentially you have I want to say these laws that are regulating how a person remains a slave, okay, and how they remain a slave is that they start having this kind of, I want to call it cultural norm. It's kind of like written into their laws too, but it's this cultural norm that says that a child's condition follows the condition of their mom. Okay. And so if the mom was enslaved and was a servant for life, then a child who is born from that mother is also then a child who is born enslaved. Part of this is rooted in like patriarchal notions, sexism, that kind of thing, where women are inherently inferior to men in this regard. Um, but this is where you get like uh, um, this notion that like bills of sale that are listing black children who are servants for life because they were born from a mom who was enslaved for life. Okay, so this is where you develop over time. You can see how like if you're driving an institution of slavery that belongs to the birthright of the mom over the course of decades, even it's not going to be hundreds of years. It's only going to be like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, etc., that you can then see how culture norms are beginning to emerge around black servitude. Now, if you're listening on IG Live, maybe it's cut off already, but it's about to cut off, so feel free to jump into the Zoom session if you'd like. But this is where we are, and this is why I will leave it here. Jen Cox says, super handy for male slaveholders, huh? Absolutely, because then it means that they can have take sexual advantage of these people. But then, like I said, part of the imperative was also the purpose of breeding more slaves so that you don't have to keep relying on the Spaniards to keep giving your money and your economic resources to the Spaniards to get slaves, so that you can just start generating wealth on your own by breeding them. And then they get their rocks off too. Okay. So we'll go ahead and leave it there for now. Um, that is this how Pokemon started? Maybe. I don't know, man. But that's where we'll leave it for now. Next week we'll wrap up this discussion, the chapter 3, being black in colonial America, what that looked like. But I'd like to open it up for open dialogue and Q&A now. Eden says, "What is something that is culturally white American other than white supremacy, if they had to let go of their cultural heritage in order to marginalize others?" Believe it or not, and I don't say this derogatorily, um, uh, but to be white in America uh, is, in essence, in a cultural sense, your cultural stake is white supremacy vis-a-vis capitalism, vis-a-vis exploitation of labor, vis-a-vis patriarchal and Christian heteronormative values in those things. But it goes all the way back to this colonial era. Um, oh yeah, props for the Bluey t-shirt. Yeah, I wear this t-shirt sometimes. My daughter likes it. Um, yeah, it's an unfortunate result of this era for all of us. Um, this is how we came to be, unfortunately. Maybe there's some alternate universe. I have this like it's a shallow belief. I don't want to say I stake my identity on it or anything, but I have this belief that like if the multiverse exists, then it's entirely reasonable and plausible to assume that if it wasn't white Europeans who were going to do this, it could have very well been Africans to do it. It could have very well been the Arabs or the Middle Easterners. It could have been some other group that carried these the operative norms of the old world to then come and quote unquote discover the Americas, that would then lead to the same outcome of the first Americans being destroyed, decimated, genocided, and then replaced with whatever comparatively adapted culture was going to replace them. Any questions?
Are we going to talk about? I was reading the chapter, and there's a little bit about the acceptance of Christianity with African peoples, you know. And I mean, I've been trying to read this for a very long time.
Hmm.
A lot of Cone's stuff I'm interested in because,
Yeah, yeah. James Cone is great. Yeah.
yeah, because I'm really interested in the true message of Jesus. I was not raised Christian. My dad had a lot of issues with conservative Christianity growing up, and so he didn't want me raised in any kind of religion. And I just find it fascinating that just from what I've been
Clear.
studying about Christianity now, is that Black people truly follow Christianity the way it's supposed to be because they know what it's like to be oppressed.
Yeah. We're, believe it or not, don't quote me on this. I think it's chapter 4, but either way, we will inevitably come to where the Christian or religious conundrum between the slaves' interpretation of the Bible and the slaveholders' interpretation of the Bible. Believe it or not, Christianity is a significant component in what we're going to be talking about throughout the duration of the course. We're just not there yet.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And the person named Darks, I want to acknowledge. I didn't mean that in a literal sense. You'll have to forgive me. I'm being a little
It's
bit
all good.
casual. But Darks mentioned in the comments, indigenous people weren't destroyed; we're still here, and I want to acknowledge that you are absolutely still here. So
Yes.
please forgive me for my choice of words. Eden,
I kind of have a question,
yeah.
and this is, I don't know if this is controversial, but I'm kind of asking if, like, since there were, like, Christianity was shaped by white supremacy and all these different things, and then the Christianity that Black people kind of curated was rooted in, I'm not going to say like their oppression, but like their liberation from the oppression. In my mind, I'm trying to say, like, is there like a true version of Christianity in a sense? Or is it always going to be shaped by the historical context or like the cultural context of the
I mean,
individuals who practice
Rasta.
it?
Yeah, well, but Rasta also has some origins that are contextually informed by the institution of enslavement, right?
I guess that's
Um,
true.
so I think with anything, um, it's any any message that is communicated through any medium can only be interpreted through subjectivity. There is no objective way to tap into
This,
whatever
yeah.
interpretation of a message. So it becomes a thing where um, you could have a book with a message that you think is clear because it explains, helps you to understand your position in the world that is fundamentally different from the way that these other people interpret that very same message. It's just the thing where, as we go on, I'm going to talk about this in detail. Like I said, we're just not there yet. But it's just that there is no objective way to truly interpret the Bible. Otherwise, everyone who identifies as a Christian would agree on everything. There wouldn't be denominations. There wouldn't be different versions or translations or things like that. And I want to add that the Quran is unique in that there is only one like translation or interpretation of the Quran, right? There aren't different versions. There's not a King James equivalent version of the Quran or anything like that. But even still, with this one version of this book, you have the Shias and the Sunnis, you have extremists, you have people who are really no distinct from like Buddhists, right? Who all are getting their wisdom and their spiritual knowledge from the same text. So it's a thing where the nature of human subjectivity plays a critical role in how people find meaning in their religiosity and in their spirituality.
Thank you.
Yeah. James says the Bible contradicts itself throughout the text. Anyone can pick up and choose passages that align with their beliefs. Yeah, I mean, essentially, you could say that about anything. Sure. Um, and then Chris says any claim to a true or superior interpretation of a historical text often functions through the lens of authoritarianism. Correct. And in the case of like the timeline of American history, you will certainly see how that plays out and feeds into the culture norm of white supremacy that frankly we still haven't addressed at any point in time. And so now it's just resurfacing because no one ever addressed it. Okay. Any other questions?
So I missed the beginning of election. Sorry,
That's okay.
but I was wondering if you went over like some of the reasons for importing African American or Africans, excuse me, to the New World, noting that folks like Pizarro brought pigs and wiped out a large portion of the indigenous population, and we just our homogeneity didn't allow us to fight off diseases. Um, I
Can
didn't
you
know
re
if you,
can you repeat the first part of your question? I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you went into some of the reasons Africans were brought into the Americas as slaves,
Hmm.
some of which being they would have been fine to use indigenous people,
Yes.
but Pizarro bringing his pigs and just Europeans bringing diseases
Yeah.
killed off many
Yeah.
indigenous people. We there are estimates that so in some books it would say if you take Native American studies that 90% of the indigenous population was wiped out from disease.
Mhm.
I don't know if you're familiar with Holmberg's
Yep,
mistake.
yep, yep, yep.
So I was just wondering if I missed the beginning of your
It's
video.
okay. I explained this on one of the previous lectures that's on the YouTube page. You're welcome to go
Okay.
back to my YouTube page. Just look up my name.
Okay.
And essentially, I'll give you the answer. The answer was that at first, the Europeans really did try to enslave the natives. Um, and they failed for a number of reasons. First of all, how do you enslave somebody in their own backyard? Like they know the terrain better than the Europeans do. That's one thing. The second thing is that they were often fighting the Europeans. And even though just by comparison, because from the old world, they're coming from thousands of years of warfare, in comparison to the natives who didn't have the same precedent of warfare and exploitation, they were just not technologically equivalent to be able to withstand fighting these people who had culturally adapted to thousands of years of warfare. Okay, so many of these people are dying due to slaughter. Then you have the introduction of communicable diseases that are weakening these people, and then those diseases are then being used as a weapon to kill them in order to create space for how their development plans. So it becomes a thing where the natives are just not ideal candidates for enslavement. But in order for you to build your empire, you still need slaves. And so they had the Spaniards and the Portuguese had already had prior relationships thousands of years prior with the West Africans who had a notorious reputation for trading slaves. And so they then went to West Africa to then get African bodies who were not they're not susceptible to the morbidity or mortality from these diseases because they have thousands of years of relationships and histories with these people that they're then taking these Africans, and then the Africans they're assuming are going to be dependent on them for survival because they don't know how to survive in these lands. So Africans then become the ideal candidate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you make a good point about being dependent. I hadn't
Mhm.
considered that before.
Yeah,
Thank you.
because then you can enslave somebody and bring them to a new land where they don't know how to survive in this land without the help of the person who's also oppressing them and enslaving them in order to survive. So it just that was the assumption. That's one of the motivations. But then on the back end, like I said in early lecture, which you'll see in the video early on, I explained that some of these Africans were able to get away. Some of them made contact and found refuge with many of these natives. They developed families with some of these natives. This is why you have native African biracial people and long lineages that go all the way back to the 1500s. So it just becomes a thing where um, some, not all, not most, but some Black people did in fact find their freedom and then found refuge among the natives. And so we're able to survive among the natives because they could learn to adapt that way. Any other questions? Yeah, Eden.
I was kind of confused on the formation of the Virginia Company.
Yeah,
And so the Virginia Company helped create or helped fund to create Jamestown, but like who created the Virginia Company again? Like I know the British did, but like
sure.
how?
That's actually the intricate details around the Virginia Company, believe it or not, I actually don't know. What I do know is that the Virginia Company or the Merchants of Virginia were a shipping company. Excuse me, I have my Invisalign in. They were a shipping company that basically would get paid by the British monarchy to go and trade resources and get other resources from Africa, from the Spaniards, from India and Asia and things like that. So ideally, if you want to fund an expenditure to the Americas, you're going to get the shipping company to do it because they already have the resources to be able to do that thing. That's as far as my knowledge goes about that. Beyond that, I really can't say. Yeah.
I have one more question.
Mhm.
I'm sure you didn't go into it now. Um, but I was wondering if you are going to or have in the past go into how slave patrols were the beginning of the police force. Um, I know, I mean, so I am a documentary filmmaker. I'm also an ex-felon, and I have a lot of interest in this. And I'm really interested in how the police force was formed in the first place. And I know it was from slave patrols was some of the origins of that. And it was also how we got our modern, you know, attitudes towards police these days. But I do you have a lecture somewhere, or are you going to in the future lecture on that?
I mention it. I know that I mention it somewhere. I have talking points on it, but I unfortunately I don't go into extensive detail. Part of the reason is because there's so much history here that it's frankly it's impossible to be able to cover like every aspect of this in absolute detail, right? So
I
um
get you.
yeah, so I mean, I go into detail on that. Yes, I do. Um, but unfortunately, I would say that the backbone of this course is more like a review of the timeline of events and the circumstances that lead to the America we know and live in today. Um, and so by the end of this, everything that you're seeing in politics, the white nationalism, the fascism, Donald Trump, all of that, it should all make sense. I don't say this lightly, but I would like to make the comparison that with the Epstein files, with the inherent corruption, with the exploitation, the like fraud and things like that. Um, if we know that the Confederates survived through time, if we know that the culture of enslavement, like exploitation, has survived and evolved through time, then it implies that slave holders and slave masters, to some extent, have also survived through time too. And in today's modern era, believe it or not, Donald Trump is basically a slave master. He acts exactly like one in multiple ways. We don't consciously, as Americans today, we don't make that connection because we're not thinking about the echoes of history and time. Uh, but if you really think about it through the lens of sexual exploitation, the exploitation of labor, the economic exploitation, the exploitation of bodies, the racism, the white supremacy, the he's a slave master, and that's kind of why all of the alt-right, far-right white supremacists kind of are so in fanaticized is the word by him, is because he embodies the very root of this problem we never addressed. And it does have cultural implications. It does overlap the investment in the preservation of their cultural norms and values as it relates to colonialism. It everything ties to the history that I'm currently teaching to you all. So sorry, I don't
And
know if I went on a tangent, but
no, you did great, and thank you for teaching. As I said to all my professors, I'm fortunate enough to have made it through college and got a master's degree. But yeah, thank you for doing what you do, because teachers are some of the best
thank you.
folks in the world, in my opinion.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you.
awesome. Fetishized, yeah, maybe that's the word. Sure. Any other questions? Hmm. Thoughts? Yeah, Eden.
I kind of have a question about race, but I'm trying to like make it make sense in my mind because I know race is not necessarily an inherent biological concept because like, certain features that we associate with certain races could show up amongst like people who don't live in Africa, I think, or something like that. But I guess my question is, because I was reading something that was saying like all the biological, like phenotypic characteristics that the different races have already existed in Africa, um, before like people started migrating outside of Africa or whatever. And I was just curious about that. It's like, so if they already existed in Africa, does that mean Africa already had like different racial groups. I know it would be different than like, American kind of race because they created whiteness as the superior race and any other race below it as less than that. But I was curious to see if they had that concept of race in Africa because these features did exist.
No. So, just on the fundamental level, especially in the old world, prior to the invention of the concept of race in America, people only ever went by geographic origin. Part of the reason for that is because in the old world, you have like literally tens of thousands of years of continuous history all throughout, I want to say, the very tip top of Scandinavia, all the way down to the very bottom of what we know today to be South Africa. There's a continuous flow of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of history. We like to think of these histories as existing in isolation and respective to these cultures and people. And to some extent, that's true. But the concept of race is one in which there was just fluid continuity. If you think about the very tip top of Scandinavia all the way down to the bottom of Africa, you just have a fluid gradient that gradually shifts. So this notion of like race is kind of arbitrary. Over time, we would then come to understand that the racial groups we observe, whether that's melanated skin, kiki coily hair, light skin, straighter textured hair, blonde hair, blue eyes, that kind of thing, they are all adaptations to their respective environmental contexts, um, relative to the equator, right? Um, and so you don't really have like you can't say these people are this color and these people are that color. That was invented in America. Back in the old world, it was just what religion are you? Where were you from? What language did you speak? That was usually how you identified yourself, and it had nothing to do with I'm black, I'm white, I'm blue, I'm purple. That was something that was invented in the Americas. Part of the reason I'll tell you the invention of this concept of white and black actually connects to the origins of the word Negro. Um, so the Spanish, like I said, developed this colloquialism of referring to their slaves as the blacks, which then implied that the British colonizers, the Spanish colonizers, the Portuguese colonizers all wanted to distinguish themselves among themselves, different from the first Americans and from the Africans. And so created the concept of white because many of them no longer identified with Spain or Portugal or Britain. So they would just go, well, if you're black, then I'm white. And how that's how that got invented. And we, for some reason, we just held on to that. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry if I'm monologuing. I don't know.
I mean, it kind of does. Like you're saying, like they didn't have this concept of race before
Mhm.
then, but it's like so it's like you're saying they're listed like the tribes that they were like, or I guess correlated, or not necessarily tribes, but like certain geographical regions that they're from. They don't necessarily like label them as a specific race.
No,
No?
no. And
Oh,
then in Africa, you have all kinds of phenotypes that for some reason today we exclusively assign to certain racial groups. You have like the what's called the Asian monolith or the Iceland. That's a, believe it or not, that's actually a phenotypic feature that exists in Africa. It exists in Europe. It exists in Australia. You have melanated skin is something that permeates not just the people from Africa, but also India, the natives of Australia, Papua New Guineans, right? You have melanated skin. Kinky coily hair is something that we can observe among who we would call white, right? Hair that defies gravity. Blonde hair, blue eyes is not something that's exclusive to Europeans. That's also a phenotypic trait that we observe among Australian indigenous Australians. It's a thing where there is no phenotype that we today conventionally associate with some racial group. None of these characteristics are exclusive to any one racial group. We're all just humans, and we all just have a cluster of different phenotypes. That's really it. Any other questions? Yeah, Dark says just as polar bears have a better chance of hunting and surveillance. No, right. Melanated skin protects against the rays, the UV rays of the sun, but in higher elevated regions, like let's say Scandinavia, where you have absolutely pale people, most of the time out of the year, there's just clouds covering. So it just becomes a thing where melanin is not environmentally relevant trait to have when you exist for generations in these regions. It's just that's how that comes about. Yeah. Vitamin D deficiency becomes an issue in the UV areas. Yes, correct. I hate to pressure you for questions. We usually go for an hour, but it seems like we're scraping the barrel here, which is not a problem. I don't mean to force anyone to.
I
Oh, Miss
joined
Tanya.
late, so
Yeah,
I might have more questions. I mean,
you're good.
I know you're busy, you're a professor, so I know that you have probably, tons of things to do, people standing outside your office during exam times and all that. Uh, um,
Tell
but
me
at
about it.
some point, um, if you would have time, like I said, I'm a filmmaker. I'm making a documentary about our prison system, and I know that that is a huge topic to speak about the police force and how it originated.
Yeah,
If you did have time, sometime in the future, I would like to ask more questions about that. I don't want to.
yeah.
One, I'm not prepared to ask those questions.
Okay.
I didn't know you did Zoom, and I'm very thrilled that you do. But I would like to go into that because, like, for a documentary, these are, especially on criminal justice system, these are things that you're gonna I need to address, right? Where did the
Yeah,
police force go? Why is there racism in our criminal justice system? Well,
yeah.
there's a billion questions that I have for you, but I'm not prepared at the moment, so I don't want to come unprepared.
Yeah, sure. No, and that's okay. The Q&A is really just open to any questions that you have, but I would encourage you to stick around every Sunday, because eventually we will get there, and then your question will be relevant to what we were talking about, right? So stick around.
That's great, and thank you.
Mhm. How much first American history will you go into in this lecture series out of curiosity? Only as it relates to the timeline of African American history in the context of this course. It's contextually relevant because we're talking about the colonization of the Americas, the displacement of these people. A lot of that history, as it relates to the timeline of U.S. history, is covered. But will we be getting into chiefs and leaders and culture norms and things like that? Unfortunately, not. That goes beyond my area of expertise. Sorry to disappoint. Yeah, last time I did ask you a question to get the ball rolling. Part of that is because of the way that the lecture goes, but because I'm covering rudimentary knowledge, it just becomes a thing where it's just like I'm going to give you that information. I'm going to force you to make connections you probably haven't made before. You're welcome to chime in and ask a question in the middle while I'm talking, but that's just where we're at. Yeah.
Can you hear me? I was
Yep.
wondering if I could ask a question.
Yeah.
Let's say you had like omnipotent power and like you control everything. How would you restructure, I guess, culture in America from your perspective?
Damn. That's a great question. Um, I suppose I have a little bit of a double-edged answer, or the double-edged sword answer. And the double-edged sword answer is I don't know if I would. Now, the reason might be more surprising than the answer. And the reason is because no matter what cultural changes I may make if I were God, it's still gonna create problems. It's still gonna create issues. Problems don't simply go away because I can address the ones that currently exist, right? So almost, I think. So I suppose as an anthropologist, I'm thinking of this question almost like a game of whack-a-mole, right? Maybe you whack a mole, but then two more pop up, and then you try to whack those two, and then three pop up, and then you whack those two, and no matter how many you whack, does that mean that the moles will stop coming? Well, no. It's almost like that. It's like what if I could make changes? Yeah, based on where I sit right now, I would make the change of a more fair, just, and equal America that truly lives up to the values it declares, and it announces that it abides by. And as you see in this class, as time goes on, you will see that African Americans have been pressuring this country to actually live up to its declared values, its own self-declared values, and that just hasn't happened. However, is that gonna fix anything? I think if anything, even as I'd like to think it's a perfect world where we're all equal and blah blah blah, I still think realistically problems don't just disappear. Um, because problems are a product of the conflicts of subjectivity. So I don't know. It's just, it's hard, and I'm sorry if that's a disappointing answer, but that's an honest one.
I mean, it's a good philosophical like thought to think. It's like
Sure.
what essentially is a sustainable humanity with the least amount of harm to every individual kind of thing.
Right. And I could be God, and it still wouldn't be perfect. If you want to entertain this notion of philosophy, then you could say God created this realm and look at the problems that we have. Right. So I
Dang.
whether you believe in God or not, philosophically, right, the point still stands that we exist in the one he created, theoretically, and shit's still wrong. So yeah.
Kind of reminds me of when I was in college in the mid 90s, went on a couple of missions trips to Mexico, Christian college. And I remember coming back just so jazzed, saying to my parents, everyone in this country, when they turn 18 or whatever, needs to go live in another country for 2 weeks or 2 months or whatever. And in my mind, that was going to fix it all.
Yeah, yeah.
Like just allowing yourself to be exposed to other environments, other people's, other ways of doing things.
Yeah.
Um, I agree with what you're saying. There's no fix, no easy fix, but gosh, diversity sure is part of it.
Don't you wish there was?
Mark
Mhm.
Twain also agreed with that.
Yeah. Right, right. Some hey, but I also like to think that to some extent, even though I like to think I have an academic understanding of the things that we're talking about, I don't know everything. There's a lot of things I don't know. Perhaps even some perspectives that I have that might change with, introduction to new information. So I can only answer that kind of question based on where I'm currently at in time, right? Yeah.
One thing I will say is like tying it to like capitalism is like very important, and it opened my mind to like capitalism being the main driving force for the enslavement of Black people, because I don't know why I never thought of it in that way, like free labor, and then they're making a profit off of that free labor. So like it makes sense, but I don't know why I never thought of it in the sense of like, because I'm trying to read like Karl Marx's work, because like people always tell me how like he's like the like leader of like communism, like all these different kinds of things. And like I don't know, I'm kind of tying some things together with like labor power, and like you selling your labor power to like the capitalists so they can make profit. And then like he's saying the variable end is like you no longer like what's the term? You working for free, which is basically the slavery that existed,
Yeah.
that usually existed to create America in its totality. But yeah, it's just like my brain is kind of tying those things together a bit. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I want you to. Most people they don't make those connections, and they never really been given the knowledge to be able to make those connections. So I'm trying to force you to do that in a way, not because I'm indoctrinating you, but because I'm genuinely trying to expose you to the truth of the reality of the country we live in. Um, James says, if we're able to address the issue of race in the United States, I think it's going to take several more generations, assuming we can raise generations of educated critical thinkers. Yeah, yeah. Traveling outside the US provides a whole new perspective that we can't get here. Being able to see how people live in other countries gives perspective of how much we have in this country. And hopefully this spurs questions as to why we can't do more for our fellow citizens. That's absolutely correct. That's something I'm currently writing a film about. Darks, to piggyback off of you, I'm a filmmaker too. And I've over the last 7 years or so, I've been like slowly pivoting my my skill set, and this is something I'm writing about, inspired in part by my experience of being a high schooler from South Central who went to live in Akita, Japan, and the eye-opening experience it was to be black outside of the context of the US at such a young age and immersed in a culture, not as a tourist, to see how people live and operate on the daily and to go to school and to have a family that supports me and to see what life was like. It was very eye-opening to when I would eventually return back to the United States. It gave me a kind of reverse culture shock. So that actually part of the reason I even ended up as fascinated in African American studies as I did was because of my experience in Japan. So, yeah. Any other questions?
And the dark is for Dark Star. I'm a deadhead.
Oh, okay.
So I also would like, Bob Weir, the last singing member of the Grateful Dead, just passed yesterday.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I heard.
I like I said, I'm also an ex-felon, and the moral to that story is don't ever bring mushrooms to Nevada.
Damn,
Never
I'm
do
sorry.
that.
I'm sorry you made that mistake, and I don't
Uh,
mean to laugh at your plight.
no,
I'm
no,
sorry.
it's fine. It's meant as a joke. Everybody laughs. That's the point.
Yeah.
I have to be able to laugh at myself. I mean, like I was fortunate to get away with 12 to 48 months. They wanted to give me 20 to life. That's not a joke. I wish it was
Jesus.
exact. Yeah. Over a little bit of mushrooms. So, and me being indigenous, I'm half indigenous. I'm Yaqui and English, Irish, and French. But that like you have your fascination with African American studies, and my own ethnicity or yeah genealogy, I would say, is what led me to the fascination with using entheogenic drugs to gain spirituality. So I completely understand.
Yeah, yeah. And I would like to also preface, I don't go into this in this class, but just on my own anthropological knowledge, a lot of the laws that regulate substances like peyote or shrooms or something like that. Shrooms, for example, what are called magic mushrooms here, the psilocybin um, mushroom is actually seen among indigenous Central and North American indigenous cultures as a spiritual medicine, um, and it's treated as such. And part of the stigma in the U.S. of these substances comes from colonial laws, patriarchy, Christian norms, that they're like demonic or they access evil spirits. And so today we see these laws as a kind of functional norm, but they're actually rooted in the stigma of indigenous norms, and outlawing the indigenous norms so that you can save their souls from damnation. And part of the reason why unfortunately, you were incarcerated for your consumption of shrooms or other entheogenic substances, is in part a function of the continued existence of colonial laws. So I'm sorry that happened. This is off topic, but I've been curious about the experience of being Black in the UK historically and currently knowing how pervasive American culture is. Um, yeah, being Black in the UK is complex in and of itself, right? You could teach an entire course on that. Um, and part of uh, what we cover in this class has implications on the black people that would end up in the UK. But I would go so far as to say their history, while different, is very much similar to Black history in the US, to keep it simple. Because ultimately, colonization is not something that took precedent just in North America, but around the world. So you can understand the implications then of being Black in the colonial state itself, right? Yeah.
Real quick,
Yeah.
you mentioned how culture can't be like, what's the word? Something something. that it's very organic, that it kind of comes on its own because of like common interests and certain things like that. How does like cultural appropriation like play into that, or what is that a component of? Because I know like a lot of people say, oh, white people take black culture all the time or something like that.
Mhm. I That's a very complicated question. I would even go so far as to say my answer, some other experts might disagree, and I don't blame them for disagreeing with me when I say this. I think the politics or the notion of cultural appropriation comes from, in essence, stealing something while stigmatizing it. And by stealing something, obviously, I'm not talking about like a valuable item from a store. I'm talking about cultural aesthetics, music, food, modes of living, dances, those kinds of things, right? Forms of expression. Um, but I don't think on its own the notion of other people adopting similar structures would inherently be problematic if they weren't simultaneously delegitimizing those things when other people do them, right? um Part of why I'm saying this actually comes from my experience in Japan is when I was in Japan, I wasn't around many foreigners. I was in a place, a prefecture called Akita. Essentially, for most of the time that I was there, I was like the only one of three foreigners in the area. Sorry, my mom just texted me. I was one of three foreigners in the area, and I I don't know. I had lots of questions that I would ask my host family, and there were a few foreigners that I would see sprinkled throughout, but it would be like the anime obsessed people, and they would be wearing like kimonos and like Japanese school outfits, either the men's school uniform that I unfortunately never fit, or the schoolgirl uniform. And I would ask my host mom and other my friends and things like that at school, like, are you not upset when you see other foreigners trying to mimic Japanese culture and things like that, especially with wearing kimonos? And they're like, no, we love it because you're embracing our culture, and we like that because you're embracing it. And it brought me to this realization that part of the reason why appropriation is problematic is because the group that is appropriating is usually the one that's also perpetuating the stigma. And if that stigma wasn't there, then I don't think people would have a problem with the appropriation. And I could point to selective examples, but then that'd be me cherry picking. No one's upset at Eminem for being a white person who's famous at rapping because he's actually talented. He doesn't stigmatize the culture. He's a part of it. Does that make sense, right? It's kind of like that. And like for these Scandinavian countries, if we adopted the political and societal structures of these Scandinavian countries, I don't think anyone's going to be mad at us. But I would certainly expect for the Scandinavians to be like, what the fuck? Who are these hypocrites who are taking things that are ours while they're also stigmatizing them while they're doing them? Like, how does that even make any sense? So I think the conflict of appropriation just comes from the simultaneous perpetuation of stigma, to keep it simple.
Thank you, thank you. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah,
Mhm.
that really cleared up because some of my buddies and like we kind of like shared the same space. Like I lived with two black people and like a country dude in my household, and eventually we ended up like rubbing off our verbiage with one another. So we all just kind of like had the same sayings
Yeah,
that we say to each other.
yeah.
And at some point, I'm just like, wait, hold on, is this like a bad thing or like how does this work? Like, what's the guidelines? Where's the book on this? You know?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't know. And it goes even it goes deeper than that. I suppose I want to say I remember when I started becoming conversationally fluent in Japanese, I remember that a lot of the expressions I would hear, I would understand through Ebonics. And I've come to learn that a lot of Japanese expression is actually similar to Ebonics, and I've always wondered why. How did that continuity survive thousands of years of linguistic evolution to the point, am I just like kind of filling in these gaps on my own, like what's happening? And I start following like these Black Japanese social media influencers who also kind of incorporate the Ebonics thing into their Japanese. So I knew I wasn't going crazy. And it goes deep. How did the African linguistic expressions survive the expansion of human populations over into their population to other regions? I have no idea. It's just a thing. Or does it exist in convergence? Did they adopt those things? Is that like a modern form of Japanese? Was older Japanese a little different? I don't know. But it's just interesting. I don't know. I would say appropriation is a very fluid concept that once you understand at a philosophical depth becomes a little bit more abstract and arbitrary. If that makes sense. I hope I'm not like, I don't sound like I'm rambling.
No, that makes sense. But yeah.
African American English is functionally superior to standard English in a lot of ways. Sure, that's an opinion. I'd have to
An
think about that.
opinion.
Yeah, I mean it's an opinion, but um, damn. But I mean, the Black English vernacular is tied to the West African linguistic roots that survived the legacy of enslavement. That's where we get a lot of those expressions from. Um, that's an interesting perspective. Hmm. Anyway, final questions here. Yeah, Eden.
I was gonna ask a question about this, but I'm gonna probably ask a question about another thing. I was gonna ask, like, I watched another video and you were talking about like combating like the negative racism that is used within our society right now. And you're saying we could use positive racism to counteract that. And I
Yes.
just didn't understand like positive racism. Like, and I didn't understand what that necessarily meant. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, sure. I give a lecture on this in if you go to my YouTube page, there's a lecture I think in the other course called Theories of Racism. I kind of expand on this, but essentially I'd like to tell this story in my class, so I'll tell the same story. Um, so first of all, I teach my students that in order for us to be able to solve the problems of racism in society, you have to understand that racism is not actually synonymous with bigotry and prejudice. It can significantly overlap, but there are many forms of racism that are not bigoted nor are prejudiced, right? Um, I sometimes I give this example in my class, and I'm sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. It varies, but I will often try to racially profile somebody. I'll go, "Hey, I'm going to assume you're Indian," and then somebody goes, "No, I'm not Indian. I'm Sri Lankan." Right. And I go, well, see, I made the assumption that you were Indian because of the visible cues and blah blah blah. And I'm drawing the conclusion that you're this thing and I'm putting you into that box. My ability to do that makes me racist. Everyone has the ability to see and distinguish different phenotypes and features. The number of faces that we see in this chat room right now, what we can kind of consciously go, oh, that person's white, oh, that person's black, oh, that person is blah blah blah, and we can see and distinguish those things. Okay, that on its own makes us racist. Does that mean we're bad people for doing so? No, right? Okay, this is a kind of benign racism. So, the racism I'm describing to you, I would define as the ability to see and distinguish and categorize people based on a generally agreed upon understanding of race, which it has the potential to give rise to oppression and injustice and inequality, but it can also produce kinds of good. And the example I have is I was teaching a biological anthropology course when I was in graduate school. And I was at the University of Washington, and most of my classes had white students, white or Asian students. And there was one student in there who was Somali. She's black, she's Muslim, she's the only one like her in this class. And maybe like within the first day or two, she comes to me in my office hours and she says, I can't afford the book. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I need this class to pass. Okay. And initially I was in my own world. So I'm like inconvenienced by this. I'm like, I was about to go to lunch. I don't really want to bother with this person. If you can't afford it, that's on you. And I'm like taking this like default rugged individualism approach before I thought to myself, well, I have a free copy of the book. This is a black student. She's underrepresented. She's Somali. She's Muslim. I don't know the entirety of her background, but I know that if she's probably coming to me and she's saying she can't afford it, I should believe her. And it's probably that I have like an ethical obligation to help her. So I didn't go get lunch. We went down to the copy room. I think, yeah, the copy room on the third floor. And we spent 2 hours scanning and photocopying every single page in the book so that she had access to what she needed. And in my mind, I knew I wasn't going to make up a reason for why I was doing this. The reason why I'm doing this is because you're black, because you're Muslim, because you're Somali. I'm going to go out of my way to help you. And like what I'm saying here is I'm not saying I would I'm not going to do this for my students because they're white so you don't get the same kind of help. Not that at all. But it is more like with the context in mind of this person coming from an underrepresented background that I know and can make those distinctions and they're coming to me with a plausible circumstance, I have an ethical obligation to do so and I am kind of using my racism as a reason for why I'm helping them. That makes me a racist. The reason why I did that was because of who they are. Does that make me a bad person? No, it doesn't. If anything, all the more it makes me a good person. And so, what you need to understand then, expanding on this, is when it comes to patterns or systems of oppression that produce racial inequality, and harm, we can see and distinguish. We can see who has the advantages, who has the disadvantages here. And if we truly care about cultivating a fair, just, and equal, emphasis on equal society, then it means that we will have to give preferential treatment to people who are coming from historically oppressed or marginalized backgrounds, and not necessarily just on the basis of race. It could be gender, it could be religion, it could be something else. But on the concept of race, since this is the one we're talking about, it may mean anti-racist discrimination, right? Because the only way you're going to get to a fair, just, and equal society is if you intentionally cultivate it. We're never going to get there by accident. So you have to be intentional about how you give privilege, how you make certain selections, how you do things, which then means you're perpetuating racism, but you're not perpetuating the one in which we're trying to produce more harm, more disadvantage. It's just more like leveling the playing field. And the only people who will ever be upset by this notion are the people who are invested in the status quo, white supremacists, right? Because to a person who benefits from white supremacy, equality feels like oppression. That's how that's going to look. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm like thinking about a lot of things right now. Think
Yes. So in essence, then I'm not a person who promotes the notion of being a positive bigot, right? There are ways I will acknowledge that there are ways in which you can be maliciously enthusiastic about the concept that I'm describing to you. However, you also hear you understand what I'm saying is that if we want to cultivate equality and move away from white supremacy, then we have to be intentional about moving away from white supremacy and cultivating equality, which then means that we're intentional about how we select, how we allocate advantage, how we give privilege, how we disseminate opportunity or knowledge, or you do have to be selective about that, but not to produce anti-white harm. It's to produce equality and to sustain it and keep it there. And the only way you're going to get there is with racism. As long as we circle jerk around this notion that racism is bigotry and prejudice, then we're never going to get there because no one's going to want to play the racism game that actually moves us to a more equitable society. Does that make sense? And so for me, unfortunately, that's an uphill battle because it means I have to change the hearts and minds of the layperson to reconceptualize racism to understand that it actually isn't synonymous with bigotry and prejudice. But if you want to see an example of what I mean, I don't know if you have Netflix, turn on Rush Hour, watch Rush Hour, watch Rush Hour 2, and see if you're not dying of laughter at how phenomenal and excellent and racist this movie is without going, oh my God, the people who made this are terrible. You'll understand exactly what I'm saying when you watch it. Okay. Well, yeah, I love Rush Hour and Rush Hour 2 were phenomenal. Rush Hour 3, not so much, but um thanks to Donald Trump, we might get a Rush Hour 4. I don't know if that's going to happen, but anyway, we'll go ahead and we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Next week we'll wrap up chapter 3 and then another Q&A and then we'll go on to chapter 4 and so on and so forth. Okay, people? Thank you so much and I hope to see you on Sunday next week. All right. Take care.